Okay, next topic for this class is doctors, physicians, what it's like to become one, what it's like to be one, the good and the bad, and the human side of being a physician, and also the issue of mistakes, of fallibility, and all the emotions surrounding that. Let's take a look at the assignments, and I just want to make a few points about each of them, and then I look forward to reading your papers about them. I'm going to stop the video of me after saying hello to everybody. Hope you guys are doing well at home. First article you all read is how do doctors think? And this article by Jerome Groopman is one of the older articles on the syllabus. And so, a little clue: whenever I have an article that's over 5, 6, 7 years old, it's because that's a really good one. It's a classic one. There's something in it that just makes no difference when you read it. It's valuable. And Jerome Groopman in this article introduces us to the way doctors think. So we tend to think of doctors as they just know so much. They have all this vast knowledge um, of medicine and the body and biochemistry and physiology and all, and they do. But as he points out, so much of medicine is actually not what you know, it's how you think. How do you rule certain things out? How do you rule certain things in? How does your mind process the limited information that you have? And he talks about uh, heuristics and ways that in limited amounts of information and oftentimes in places of stress, uh, our mind, our cognitive psychology has shortcuts. And those shortcuts can work really well in getting us right to the point of an accurate diagnosis and getting a patient healed. And that's, in fact, all of us in our life and different areas, we don't necessarily think that we're using heuristics, but all of us are using mental shortcuts and ways to get at what we think are the more accurate conclusions. And in this article, it's about how occasionally those little cognitive psychology tricks fail. They steer us down the wrong way. Um, he starts off the article with about the heuristic of representative error, that you know, the doctors make such errors when their thinking is overly influenced by what is typically true. They fail to consider possibilities that contradict their mental templates of a disease and thus attribute symptoms to the wrong cause. So you start, as this little byline says, most physicians already have in mind 2 or 3 possible diagnoses within minutes of meeting a patient. And that's natural. When you see, especially in a specialty, you're seeing the same basic types of patients over and over again with the same similar ailments. Oftentimes, you just start hearing the symptoms, look at their most obvious clues, and you make a determination. And many times it's right. But as he notes in his article, if you get into that mentality and then you start looking at things, you start seeing symptoms that don't match that. Instead of seeing the symptoms that don't match and then having that make you back up and reassess, our minds, all of us, look at those things that don't match up and say, oh, that does match up in a different way. Or, it will match up eventually when the disease is on to the next stage. Um, another another heuristic that can take you down the wrong path is one called availability, which refers to the tendency to judge the likelihood of an event by the ease with which relevant examples come to mind. And you start looking at some of these symptoms and you think, oh, it's this. And then, but once you get to that conclusion, it feels good, and you don't come back and recheck it and say, well, what are the things in the availability heuristic that would point in the other direction? And can we at least take some time to address those and see if we either continue looking into it, or if we look into it and they say no, they've been absolved, we can move on. We just stick with our initial decision. We call it cognitive cherry picking or confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is confirming what you expect to find by selectively accepting or ignoring information. Another just typical thing, and it's not just in medicine. I think and teachers have it when they see the third student office hour visit, and it's a problem with this or this test or that homework, and you think, oh, I've got this, and then you realize, oh, no, 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 they got that. They didn't get something else, but I've seen so many students with a similar problem. I just assume that the next student has that. And it's just interesting, these articles written by a doctor for other doctors to say there are these cognitive biases. There are these shortcuts that all decision makers have. So it's not that that's just a bad thing. It's a thing that should cause us concern, but the recognizing of it, knowing that these patterns exist in our minds is awesome, because then you can set up protocols. And I think one of the themes of all these articles today is stop putting all of the onus on individual clinicians to address all of these issues and shortages and fatigue and biases. Instead, the best healthcare systems are systems. They build in duplication and redundancies and mechanisms for overlapping review, so that if your bias kicks in, someone else for whom it won't kick in will catch it. You hear this all the time in the healthcare world, which is the better places for care are not necessarily places that have quote unquote better clinicians. They're places that have better systems. They assume the mistakes are going to be made. Mistakes are always being made, because so many times you have a test or some symptoms. It could be 5, 10 different things. And then you do more tests and more tests, and it gives you maybe a little bit more clarity, but then it also injects a little bit more ambiguity. You're going to have that. So you're going to have quote unquote mistakes. The places that are good are the places that A, have the honesty to admit that, and B, to build systems around catching them. It's such a totally different way of looking at the world. And healthcare really gives us that opportunity to say, we all make mistakes. Professors make mistakes, parents make mistakes, police officers make mistakes, doctors, nurses, clinicians make mistakes. It's part of being human. Um, that's not great. But what is great is building systems with overlapping jurisdiction, overlapping review, overlapping checking to catch those. That's one of the good things about when you team teach a course or team author an article. Because you have a person who can just look at what you're doing and say, oh, you didn't mean that. Or, do you want to check that again? And they catch it. And then conversely, when they're in charge and they're giving a lecture or doing a procedure, and they make a mistake, you can catch it and say, oh, you didn't mean to say this. That wasn't the intention, or double check that again. So this first article by Jerome Groopman introduces all of us to something that the last TED Talk um, does a really good job of asking us to consider. Brian Goldman's TED Talk is that, can we talk about this? Can we talk about biases, cognitive shortcuts that work most of the time, but then fail us at other times? Can we have an acknowledgement that we make mistakes? It's almost a stigmatized taboo to say we make mistakes, but clearly we do. And so the first healthy thing is to say, yep, we do. And we're building models and programs and systems that are designed to spot for and look for the mistakes we already assume are being made, and tries to catch them, rescue them, address them, and then hopefully in the future prevent the rate of them from going up. And it's also, now we didn't get a chance to add it because there were so many assignments for this class as it is. But the next author, Eric Topol, who talks about should doctors organize, is actually also one of the biggest proponents of artificial intelligence being used in medicine more and more, not to replace human decision making, but to aid and assist it, because people get tired, they get hungry, they get fatigued. And the proper use of artificial intelligence and algorithms that can be narrowly tailored to catch some of these mistakes can really help clinicians build in that redundancy, and looking for patterns over thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of cases can help decision makers when you get that extra boost and support. So the next author, Eric Topol, you can read some of his other work that he says using artificial intelligence, pattern recognition, um, deep intelligence, deep machine learning can help clinicians address some of these areas where mistakes are made. Interestingly, the article that I did assign for you from Eric Topol isn't about that, but it's about, should doctors organize? And it's just, a really interesting argument because we have all these other organizations and unions, but doctors haven't really ever leveraged a very unique amount of power. There's 800 to 900,000 doctors. You could not replace them. It's physically not possible. Other jobs, warehouse workers, even professors, if we quit, well, you could replace us very easily. Doctors take 4 years of medical school, 3 to 7 to 8 to 9 years of residency. If they all decided to get organized and take over the healthcare system, or at least address the things that drive them crazy, they could do it. And then his point is that one of the interesting things is that they haven't done it. And part of the reason they haven't done it, now this is a point that doctors probably need to listen to. His argument is that they haven't because the amount that doctors do organize tends to be about just whatever concerns them. It's their own remuneration, it's their own professional record keeping. Um, his argument is that doctors should organize to change tiresome, burdensome things like electronic health records that would improve their life, but it would also improve the patients and their experiences. And that this is something that doctors could step up, and it actually connects back to one of the first TED Talks by Dr. Dan, the millennials in medicine, saying, millennials and even the younger generation going into medicine, you don't have to put up with this. Maybe that's something that a new generation can finally say, I know we've accepted this and we've inherited it from our previous generations of doctors, and they did as well, but you don't have to do it. And an example of this is when physicians started asking, are there guns at home? And they were doing screenings and checks. And the NRA put out this bulletin saying, hey, doctor, stay in your lane. You have no business talking about guns. And then all this great doctor response came out saying, excuse me, do you have any idea how many bullets I pull out of corpses weekly? This isn't just my lane, it's my highway. And doctors came online and said, hey, we deal with the downstream consequences of gun violence every day. It's horrible. It is brutal. It is expensive. It involves horrible conversations with people to explain to them why their loved one has been killed. So no, we're not going to stay in our lane. We're going to get out of our quote unquote lane and weigh in on things that end up in our emergency rooms and end up in our offices day after day after day. And we're going to say, this needs to be changed. And it just shows, the power of if doctors organized, and if they organized not just around things that they want, but if they organized around things that were for their patients' benefit, if they organized and lobbied and advocated for things for the public good, that would be great in its own way. And it also would probably rebound back to the physicians in increased public support for the things that they want, like better work-life balance, better support, more control, more autonomy. One of the things that makes doctor unionizing or doctor organizing difficult is that back around after World War II, there was this pivotal switch. And before that, most physicians were general family practitioners. There really wasn't much specialization in medicine. And then after World War II, with the rise of more biomedical science, and then the passage of Medicare, which provided more residency slots, and just the natural course of science, what you end up with is a lot more specialization, right? And a lot specialist GPs. And there's this big switch. There wasn't as much specialization before World War II. And after World War II, you begin to see the shift. And now, 2/3 to 3/4 of physicians are specialists. And it kind of makes sense. There's a logic to it. It's good to specialize. You tend to get better at it. But it's also led to this massive proliferation of specialty societies to which physicians tend to be a lot more loyal than to the broader group of the American Medical Association. And this makes it harder for doctors to organize as one group and leverage the strength of almost 1 million doctors, as they tend to be tribal and go to their specialty. But just a great article by a doctor to doctors and to the public saying, hey, doctors, we have all this power we're leaving on the table, we're not using, because we tend to organize around our own interests. But there's so much that doctors could weigh in on that's public health and healthcare related on behalf of their patients, on behalf of the public. That would then also would be a good thing to do in its own right. That would also, in the end, be to the benefit of doctors, because once you advocate for others and a larger good, then when you advocate for yourself, you've built up this goodwill. Now, that's all sounds good. physicians come from different political interests and backgrounds and philosophies, so this would be quite daunting to do. But you put people through 4 years of medical school and residency, there is, a scientific level of thinking, a way of, there's a professionalism, there's a culture of medicine that could bond and bind physicians to being more able to organize for the public good and then also for themselves. And that's an example, a really good one. Why doctors should organize. Okay, the next article, A Doctor's Diary by Gina Siddiqui. I think that's her name. I hope I pronounced that right, Siddiqui. And she gives a great insight into what works in U.S. healthcare on the patient level and the clinician level in an ER, and what do you see over and over again that doesn't work. And what she highlights really well is that the emergency department is where all of society's failings, all of its unattended issues end up in the emergency department. That's just like, it becomes the ultimate receptacle for things that have fallen apart, for things that haven't been attended to. For now, it's there for emergencies too. It definitely is there for emergencies, as the name suggests. But as she goes through all the different cases, she has basically one of two options: up to the hospital for admitting, or address it, deal with it, and then out. Because the emergency department is not an inpatient section of the hospital. It's a place where they're doing triage, and they're either assessing and stabilizing patients who need more care up into the hospital, or they've addressed whatever the issue is. It doesn't need to be admitted, and they're out. It's an up and out philosophy of attending to patients. And then what she also goes on to highlight is how many things she deals with are things because she has a patient who dies of asthma because they didn't have a nebulizer, $5 medication. That's a failing of the larger health system that then on the individual level leaves a patient in the hospital in an acute situation for individual doctors and nurses to try to rescue the failings of a system. And you can't just say, well, that's unfortunate, we need to build a better system. Their clinicians still have to be at the emergency department. This doesn't go away. This is one of the great things about these readings, is that you can walk away, you can sit at home and stay at home as you're told, but when problems still go on as they do, there's going to have to be somebody, a whole set of people that's in the emergency department in other clinical settings, that don't have the luxury to go home and say, oh, that's unfortunate, we should talk about that. They have to deal with it. And the emergency department is just one of the great windows or portals onto all the problems in life that don't get addressed. They end up getting addressed one way or another in the emergency department. And I want to take a moment just because I want you guys to see her. She gave a great talk, a really great talk about living our life trying to meet all these metrics that we have.
And it's not just doctors. Are trained to obsess over the metrics, the measures that can show what a good job you're doing. Sales, clients, books, publications, followers, downloads. You guys know what your boss and your peers are tracking for you guys. And this mindset can spill over into our personal lives. We'll do the sprints, we'll call in Mother's Day on anniversaries, and we'll skip the stretches. We won't call just to say hi or to check in on someone who needs you unexpectedly. Sprinting without stretching. What about when somebody is chugging along? They're doing a great job. They're hitting all of their targets on the outside. Their resume is getting longer, line by line. What's happening internally for them? Are they building those stabilizing muscles? Because if they're not, when they make a slight misstep, the terrain changes even a little bit, they can fall.
Just as background, if you can hear this, she's a runner who got into the habit of just running without any stretching or preparation, and then she pulled a muscle, had to go see some clinician to have her treated, and the clinician was saying, hey, you got to do all the little things. Definitely keep running, but just take a little time before the run and after the run to do the non-glamorous stuff, the stretching that gets you ready for the run. Because if you just do the run, you're going to use a certain set of muscles and not use other supportive muscles that by definition, are just as important. They just aren't part of the actual run.
That is what Peace Love Studios is about to me. It's sort of like a big middle finger at all these measurements and all these metrics. Peace Love is artistic expression for yourself and for nobody else, not linked to any external permission or to impress anybody else. It's saying that reflecting internally and expressing yourself is worth your time. That is what Peace Love Studios has to teach doctors like me and other people who are a little bit too fixated on results. First, mental health cannot be measured the way we're measuring other types of success. Second, having those external markers of success is no indicator that you don't need to do the work of mental health. Third, that mental health takes time and work. There are no shortcuts. And fourth, that if you make that investment, if you spend that time on your mental health, you're going to be prepared to handle the ups and downs of life in a different way. You're going to have that stability and that resilience. And if you don't, even a small misstep could render you down. I want to take this time to think about all the people in this room who are doing something about this. The creators in the audience who are doing the hard work on the ground to bring this opportunity to communities all around the country, all around the world. And the companies here who are trying to change the culture in their organizations, and by funding this for their employees, they're spending time with their teams, they're making it possible for Peace Love Studios to do this for communities that otherwise couldn't afford it. Let's give everybody here who's doing that a round of applause.
I encourage you to watch the rest of that. It's such a good video. And it's interesting that, so she writes this article about the ER, and she gives her one of the few talks I could find online about mental health, because it's such a big deal. Such a big deal for clinicians. So please watch the rest of that. You can see this theme very much here in the next. You can hear my dog. Amber, it's okay. It's Amber. It's all good. It's all good. Stand down. Amber, it's all good. It's all good. It's all good. Okay. All right. Well, that's our dog Amber. You guys heard her. Guys, I don't know. You guys watch this Doctors Tomorrow. Just at this Long Island Medical School at Hofstra, just trying to remind the clinicians from day one as EMT trained clinicians, which is a really cool concept. We start medical school by having med students be EMTs out in the settings that bring patients to the hospital in the first place. Is trying to inculcate an empathy. We start this class on empathy because the med school that does this knows that for the next 4 years, empathy is going to be something that can be fallen by the wayside. There's so much learning, so much stress, so much anxiety about the tests that they want to start med school on an empathetic, curious note about what makes a patient, and what are the things you want to look for. It's just, and then it goes through gross anatomy, which, it's just, it reminds you, like, it takes so long for doctors to become doctors, and they have to go through a lot that really is mentally and emotionally draining, which also you see in the 4 years of medical school. I thought it was a great overview of and it's just a reminder. I keep saying this, a reminder. It's hard. They clearly, the vast majority do it and they get through it. But I think it's really important for professors like me and Dr. Vaughn and others to remind ourselves that students who are going into these careers, doctor in particular, but also nursing and dentistry and all the other clinicians, the caregiving professions, it's a long slog. It's a long emotional slog, up and down, with not knowing exactly how it's going to turn out. You have to have faith and hope that if you work hard, you'll make it. And the evidence suggests that that is true, that the system works for the most part. The system being the tests you take, the GPA, the proficiencies, it quote unquote works. It has some unintended side effects. It's too expensive and too long, so it excludes people who are lower income. Sometimes it excludes people who would be good but just don't always crush the tests. So it's not perfect, but the system works relatively well. But this is a great insight onto the 4 years of med school. The first year being how the body works when it's well and normal, and it's just a massive crash course on the body when it's normal. And the second year is a crash course and deep dive into abnormal sicknesses and illnesses, what happens when things aren't working well. Then you take that huge step one test at the end of your second year that is like MCAT and SAT and GRE and ACT on steroids. Enormously stressful, takes months of preparation. And then from there, third year, you pivot and you start spending less time doing book learning. You start doing your series of rotations. And these are the different rotations you go on: internal medicine, family medicine, general surgery, psychiatry, neurology, pediatrics, OBGYN, and emergency medicine. It's designed for you to see the whole gamut of medicine. It's also designed to give medical students some insights into where are they going to want to specialize and what area will they want to do their residency in. And it's it's the year you start getting closer to the reason why you went to med school in the first place, which is you're actually helping people. But that's also the year that you're at the very bottom of the hierarchy and the very bottom of confidence, and you're wearing a white coat, and patients think that you're a clinician. They might be mistaken that you're a doctor. But that's where you hit into that thing that you've seen already in healthcare, in medicine, the hierarchy. How medicine and hospitals have big hierarchies, and you feel it that third year. And then the fourth year, you spend the bulk of the year really getting down to the work of interviewing and matching of your residency. It's the year you date, or you go on speed dating to figure out where you're going to go and how that's going to play out. And I don't know, if you ever want to watch some cool videos, you saw it in the Loma Linda one. Is March 15th is usually the day at every med school that this whole process plays out. And I just want to say for one moment how interesting the residency match program is. And it's very different than applying to medical school. It's different than medical school and different than applying to college. When you apply to college, you put your Common App in and you look at 5-10 different colleges. You can get into all of them. You can get into none of them. And you go around and in your mind, you kind of portray them all as your first choice so you have a chance to get in. And then you see what you get in and you choose one. Medical schools and residencies take a different approach, which is you interview your fourth year. You interview at teaching hospitals for the specialties you want to specialize in. They're also interviewing you. And then you rank order the ones you want from top, one you want the most to the bottom. They also rank all the people that apply to them. And then a computer system finds the equilibrium points in all of this. And then you walk in and you don't get into 5 residency programs. You get into 1, and that's the one you go to. And these are the total number of applicants over the last 70 years. And these are the number of positions. There's sometimes there are more applicants than there are matches. And it's interesting to note that the DO schools used to have a gap. The MD schools, most people matched. And then there was a gap, like a 25-point gap. That gap is almost closed now. So you go to DO programs, you're going to match almost at the same rate as medical MD schools. And then the balance is filled by foreign trained medical students. The last thing I want to close on, I thought was a great sort of closure to the themes of this individual class and then back to the beginning, is the TED Talk by Brian Goldman on Doctors Make Mistakes. Can we talk about that? And it's a really good reminder that healthcare and medicine is delivered to human beings by human beings. Human beings with the same fears, anxieties, same excitement, the same desire to help, and that mistakes are made. It happens, which also brings to mind Atul Gawande's commencement address several years ago, where he highlighted research that showed there weren't hospitals that were bad that made mistakes, and there were hospitals that were good that didn't make mistakes. Research showed that all hospitals make mistakes. The complication rates after surgery were almost the same in both sets of hospitals. Instead, what they proved to be really great was at rescuing people. the great, quote unquote, great hospitals made more or less errors at the same rate, but they were a lot better at rescuing from the mistakes, right? And that's the point. When things go wrong, there seem to be three main pitfalls to avoid, three ways to fail to rescue. You could choose a wrong plan, an inadequate plan, or no plan at all, right? We're going to make mistakes. It's how do you respond to them, right? That's the key. And then he applies this to our personal lives. You're going to make mistakes. I know sometimes in college, it's just, there is this acute fear of making a mistake because maybe a lot of you haven't really made many up to that point. Things have kind of gone well for the most part. And maybe some of you got into college and you really can't think of a big mistake you've made academically. And then you have one and everything crumbles. These readings, these TED Talks, these assignments remind us that in healthcare, as in every other area of life, there are mistakes, and mistakes get made on a regular basis. That's to this point been unavoidable. But what is avoidable is to fail to have a rescue plan, to fail to adjust and recover and catch it. That's where you see variation. You see people and organizations that rescue, that catch mistakes, that prevent bad outcomes, not because they don't make a mistake in the first place, but because they have whole systems designed to catch and recover from mistakes. And then there's places that sort of are just in denial. They just do not acknowledge that mistakes are made. And hence, if you don't admit that there being mistakes, then you're not going to have time for anything that would actually acknowledge that and rescue anything. And that's the dangerous thing. And you see this in so many areas of life. I'll give another example. Schools have been forced to, thankfully, be honest about assaults on campus. And so when you hear a school that says, oh, we had no assaults, no sexual assaults, that should kind of concern you. In fact, it should scare you, because if they say we've had 0 this year or the last 5 years, that's denial. Things happen. It's really unfortunate. It's horrible. But the places that actually report more numbers are the ones that are actually oftentimes doing more about it. And they've already gotten past the denial stage to say, we know these things happen, and we have programs in places and recoveries. And so we report the numbers to track it so that we can do a better job. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed the readings. I look forward to reading your SAC papers.
You have stopped screen share.